So, perspectives from the top. Today I am interviewing an expert in the automotive industry, somebody who started off as an apprentice, worked his way up through Austin Rover, then moved over to Nissan, became the chief planning officer of Nissan, has been given the accolade of the third most influential marketer, not only in the automotive industry, but globally, elevating marketing to a science. Joined Aston Martin in 2014, the iconic British brand. It's my great pleasure this morning to be talking to Andy Palmer, Chief Executive of Aston Martin. Andy.
Good morning.
Good morning. So, over your significantly varied career, what's your perception of the importance of leaders getting people to genuinely care about what they do at all levels?
It's interesting, isn't it? Because leadership implies there's a task to be led and to be done, and that's often in the context of turnaround or strategy introductions. And knowing if you talk with the McKinseys of the world, that they'll tell you that the majority of change fails. It implies that the leadership style is important. And at least from what I've seen over many years, it's about engaging with a team, because the CEO and the CEO's office, one guy out of 250,000 or whatever the number is, isn't going to make a change by him or herself. The key, I think, is giving a direction, giving a North Pole, and then guiding and inspiring. And I think the guiding is really important, because at least my management style point of view, I guess I would say I've seen two kinds of management styles. If I boil it down to simple stuff, I've seen the Napoleon style, and I've seen the Wellington style. I think I fall into the Wellington style. The Napoleonic style is, extraordinarily high IQ, thought it all through, brilliant chess players, sit in their office or at the back of the battlefield, strategize, watch, direct, order, and that's fine. I think I don't have that extraordinary high IQ, and my career has always been down at the front line. The Wellington style was to inspire your troops when the battle is almost lost, and inspire them back to fight, and not be afraid of engaging on the front line, risking, if you will, the bullets that fly on the front line, because the knowledge only comes from what the Japanese would call the gemba, or the front line. And that's my particular style, and hopefully that has the tendency, therefore, to inspire the troops.
And therefore, I think there's 2 points about that. The first point is it's about making sure that you at the top are getting the messages in terms of critical information about what's going on the front line.
Yes.
But also, doesn't that therefore impose a burden on the leaders between you and the people on the front line to also do the inspiration?
Yes, it does. And therefore, I think it's really important that you inspire each management layer. I mean, one of the first things that I've done, two things that I've done since coming at Aston Martin, two things that I think are profound. One is that I removed two layers of management. If you want the COO line, there were two, which was basically two people into one. And I have a very flat structure now, so I have 12 people on my first line. And then there was a layer below that, which was the so-called ML3. Doesn't matter what it is, but it was also a buffer layer. So by taking two of the 5 layers of management, you automatically eliminate the possibility of filtering. It's harder work, of course, because now I have to manage 12 different people, and therefore you're flipping your mind between different disciplines on a constant basis. I prefer it like that. The other thing that I've used throughout my career, actually it was the subject of my PhD, is something called Hoshinkanri, which is broadly translates as policy deployment. And what it does is it takes the leader's vision, and in this case the leader's vision is about making Aston Martin as the great British car company that makes automotive art, translating that into the measurables, which of course are profitability, free cash flow, and the multiple that we ultimately value the company at.
Yeah.
Takes it through 6 pillars, takes it then through a few hundred tactics, assigns KPIs to those which directly relate back to the vision, applies. Every manager has at least one cross-functional team that they're leading, and therefore everybody in the company can visually see that their input to their daily job, the Gemba again, has a direct relationship to the success of the company in the medium term. And it's a relatively, conceptually it's relatively simple to understand, but it helps ensure that the communication from the top is reaching the communication at the bottom and vice versa.
Yeah, and that I find interesting because there's data from a number of sources. One source effectively says that merely by telling people how what they do on a day-to-day basis contributes to the big picture can elicit up to 35% more effort.
Yeah.
Because somebody sees how they contribute. But if you look over your career, though, this is effectively about bosses inspiring people. If you look back, can you identify perhaps a boss that inspired you on a day-to-day basis, and what were the sort of things they did that inspired you?
I think there are 2 ways of learning. Actually, I don't think anybody is good boss, bad boss. We all have our good bits and bad bits, and for each of the guys that I've worked through over my career. And I guess 2 or 3 in particular, I've taken out both goods and bads. I mean, I've worked for some great leaders over my time, and I've worked for some very, very clever people over my time that aren't particularly good leaders. And I think you learn as much from the not so good bits as you do from the really good bits, to be honest. And I think that's hopefully that forms my character. And I'm sure that people will look at me and say, well, he's got good bits and bad bits.
And therefore, to some degree, as a chief executive or somebody leading a team, that's about selecting people that complement your good bits or bad bits, depending on what you want to do within the team.
And I do think that is really, really important.
Yeah.
As I came into Aston, obviously part of what I've done is I've formed a team which I hope, at least in my opinion, is compensating capabilities.
Yes.
And I've got a mixture of experts that are very process orientated to inspirational artists that are obviously very emotional. And individually, they have their own strengths and weaknesses. Collectively, you have an awesome team.
Yeah. And as we're sitting here in front of beautiful cars, then that leads on to the comment you made about the emotional element of it. And one of the things I repeatedly see around the world is an assumption by leaders that as long as they present a rational case for people to do stuff, they will get success. And many of them completely ignore what I think is critical, which is the emotional element of belief.
If you think about almost any transformation, and if you take the most extreme transformations, and I would say, winning a war is one of those. And we think of Churchill, for example, or if you talk about a winning sports team, inevitably they have the discipline that comes through a very focused individual, the coach or the leader, but not without adding that emotional context to it. So you've got to love what you're doing. You've got to bring meaning to your life, a higher meaning than simply make more profit. In our case, we talk about this great British car company, or more specifically, the great British car company. We talk about automotive art because everything we do is for the love of beautiful. We're here almost on a crusade to save the British car company and to save this 103-year brand. None of that is rational, because the rational point is we've got a strong brand that we can measure, maths to marketing, and we should make a lot of money. That's very rational. But you get the extra mile from probably the most important asset that we have, which is our people, by inspiring.
And that I think the emotional element is really interesting because exactly as you say, that emotional element, the belief, takes you up another gear. Some of the figures I've seen would suggest that the average employee's decision to give high performance is about 60% rational. Does this make sense? And 40% emotional. Do I believe in it? So I think too many leaders just underestimate that just presenting we need to do this because of this rational reason is enough to get the best.
And certainly, videos from the CEO office don't inspire that kind of leadership, and it's not a one-off town hall speech.
No.
I think it's the behaviour every day of when you walk into the workshop, into the factory space, and you continuously give that message. If it's a 6-year plan, for 6 years, you add meaning to it.
Yeah, your word there, visibility, I think is key, because in the end, I think people perform better if they are clear in their mind that everybody's in it together.
Yes.
And it's not them and us.
What I would say, of course, and perhaps the reason it doesn't always happen is it's extraordinarily hard. Mm-hmm. Basically, when you go and talk to people, you essentially remove your armour. You don't have your PR people and administrative staff all around you. You don't have the benefit of 3 or 4 doors to get to your office. You become a person, and the persona that you might project about being, basically very, very confident and very smart. People smell the bullshit pretty quickly when you're standing in front of them and talking to them.
But you're absolutely right on that. But then again, the concept of the chief executive who gets everything right is, in my view, essentially a stupid idea, because does anybody believe that any other human being has always been right? The reality of humanity is the people on the shop floor know that as a human being you must have made mistakes. The fact that you give the impression you've never made a mistake blows your credibility completely from the word go.
I think to be a CEO implies that you've both made mistakes, but the most important thing is that you've learned from those mistakes. And I always say to people, you're not going to get fired for making a mistake, that's for sure, but we're going to have a serious conversation if you keep making the same mistake.
That's a really interesting point, because if I look at the organisations that we see around us, from any number of commercial organisations, UK National Health Service, whatever, one of the things that I think kills success is where there is a blame culture and nobody's prepared to innovate or try new things.
Yeah.
And in your business, you have to be doing new things.
Frankly, but we can see that. I don't know the ins and outs of the Volkswagen diesel issue, but for sure, part of Volkswagen's management culture prevented the engineers from highlighting their concerns with meeting the emission cycles. And obviously, no boss wants people tramping into their office and saying, "Boss, I'm in trouble again." And naturally, the instantaneous reaction is a flare of anger. How did we get here? But what they're doing is, if they're walking into your office, it's a call for help, and it's an assumption that somehow or other you have some expertise or experience that can help me. And that's the way you have to take it. And then I think at the end of it, and this is something that I learned from living in Japan for 13 years, the Japanese embrace the Deming PDCA cycle, the Kaizen cycle. So, the end of all of those discussion is, what did I learn? And how am I going to ensure that it never happens again? Poke-yoke, as it translates into the manufacturing sense. Ensure there can be no reoccurrence of this problem in the future.
Well, yes, and interestingly, that sort of feedback cycle works not only in Nissan and sort of organisations that work with that technical process, but from my own experience, you know, as an ex-British Army officer, that is something that the military does at the end of each operation to make sure that we go up a gear the next time we do this.
Yes, indeed. Well, in the army, of course, if you're shot, it tends to hurt, and you definitely don't want that to happen again.
Well, there is an incentive for getting things right first time. Now, what I find interesting, though, your experience in terms of Nissan, which is not a small organisation, coming to Aston, I look at large organisations that have grown up from being small entrepreneurial organisations, and the entrepreneurial spirit has vanished, and it's become a system that is almost self-sustaining. And in one organisation, the UBS I work with, a lot of effort was put in to try and rekindle the entrepreneurial spirit.
Yes.
Do you think that the lack of entrepreneurial spirit is a challenge for big organisations, and how do you deal with that and generate that here at Aston?
I think it depends where you are in your innovation cycle.
Right. Yeah.
There are times when you need that startup mentality. There are times where you welcome the creative chaos, and there are some times in a company's life cycle where you just need on process, make the sausage machines make perfect sausages. As the organisation becomes more complex, different parts of the organisation need different parts of the cycle at different times, so it's quite complicated. For Aston, what we need right now is we need to be a 103-year-old startup.
Yeah.
So we're in that innovation stage where, of course, we have to draw back on our history, which is about making beautiful cars, but we have to discover how a company of 2,500 people can compete in a market where you have the big boys, part of big groups with perhaps 250,000 people, how we can compete with them. And the key asset we have is talented, passionate people and the agility of the organisation to respond.
Yep. Talented and sort of the inspired people is interesting, because one of the things that I repeatedly think is critical to organisations getting to the limit of the success that's possible. And I believe many organisations haven't got anywhere near the success that's possible yet, is the fact that you have got a situation where every single one of your employees is a proactive brand ambassador for your organisation. Not in the sense of necessarily selling its services, but saying to their friends, family, this is a great place to work, I believe in what I'm doing. You must think that is critical as well.
Yes, absolutely. I was reflecting on your point about teams and getting everything out of them, and I was thinking of the British Olympic team that I watched in Rio.
Yeah.
You know, there's a team GB, that managed to achieve some outstanding things.
Absolutely.
But perfection would have been a goal in every discipline, and it didn't achieve that. Therefore, in spite of a record level of medals, it still has room for improvement, and it's probably an example of the best team that there is, like that I can think of right now. So there's always more to go. There's always more in the tank.
And the funny thing is that actually, sort of speaking to fund managers and other people in the city, when you tell them actually there's more in the tank and that might produce 10% more on bottom line, they think, well, why don't we do something about it? But then my comment to them is, because you need to inspire people to achieve that. To finish off on this part then, if you were to give one or two pieces of advice to a developing leader, a young leader that wants to get success and inspire people, that's based on your career journey, what would those simple things be?
I would say that advice is very personal, so there's no magic. But what I tell my kids, perhaps, and they they're at university or just entering into their career steps, and they ask me, what did you do better than your colleagues? And I'll always tell them, there were, in my cohort, there were cleverer people than me, there were more talented people than me, But the one thing that I always did better than anybody else is I worked harder. And when I failed at something, or when I was 9 out of 10, I was always going back and working harder and trying to be the best. And I always think that somebody working harder and being motivated to something is more than equal to someone that's just plain talented and has a more laissez-faire approach to work. So hard work for me always wins over brilliance. But if you can bring the two together in some way, then you can't help but succeed. If you've got a reasonable intellect, but you're focused, inspired, and you're prepared to work your butt off, you're going to succeed.
Yeah. So it's about putting in the effort, but also in terms of the relationship with people. Something that repeatedly comes out in terms of talking to leaders around the world at all levels is people say it's about building trust.
Yeah, and again, that's for me is, I suppose, I've glibly said working hard, it's one element. Undoubtedly knowing your own discipline, this brings you respect.
Yeah.
So you need to be deep in something. Just being superficial everywhere, I've not found that to be very inspiring. So, and the trust comes from the fact somehow or other you're respected in your particular discipline. It doesn't really matter what it is. Mine's engineering.
Yeah.
And then you're right. Over and above that is always the will to learn.
Yeah.
There's more that you need to know. And as you move into leadership, it's all about selling your vision, creating trust. You want people to walk through walls for you.
Yes.
And people won't do that based on pure rational reasons. They need that emotional connection as well.
Brilliant. That is superb, Andy. Thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.